And Amy, well, a lot of blame to go around for the chemical attack in Syria last week. You got Assad, you got Putin, and according to John McCain, you have Trump.
Do you think the administration did anything to encourage this behavior by the Syrians by saying that the Syrian people would determine Assad's fate and that removing him is not a priority, things that were said before the use of chemical weapons?
I think it probably was partially to blame, and Secretary Tillerson basically saying the same thing after kind of contradicting himself and then saying the same thing argues vigorously for a plan and a strategy.
Partially to blame for the chemical weapons attack against the Syrian people is the Trump administration, according to John McCain. Well, that's a fairly curious and strong statement. For more on the topic of Syrian policy and all of the political threats we face, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning. Glad to be with you again.
So is John McCain overstating the case when he suggests that the Trump administration is partly to blame because of Rex Tillerson saying that the Syrian people will determine the future of Syria?
Well, I think you have to worry about it. I don't think it was statements by Trump himself and not by Tillerson alone, but foreign adversaries watch very carefully what American diplomats and leaders say. So you remember probably the most famous example in 1950, Dean Acheson gives a speech delimiting the U.S. defensive perimeter in Asia, and he leaves out South Korea. And a short time thereafter, North Korea invades South Korea. Or the famous conversation between April Glaspie, the new ambassador to Iraq, and Saddam Hussein in the summer of 1990, where he says, well, we don't get involved in disputes between Arab countries on borders. And shortly after that, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and history follows from that. So I think it's important, and it's important after Sunday's talk shows that the administration speak with one voice. I think Trump himself has been very clear here that his decision to launch the cruise missile attack against the base from which the Syrian government launched those chemical weapons strikes against their own population was very precise, targeted, and the rationale was narrowly drawn. A lot of people are making inferences from that and speculating about what comes next. Trump hasn't given any indication that his fundamental view that the real priority there is ISIS has changed at all.
So, but then you have muddled messages, because then you have, the position they used to hold, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, saying that we need a regime, or there's going to be a regime change.
Well, as I say, ultimately the president makes the decision, and there have been conflicting signals both before the strike and now after the strike. So presumably that will get cleared up at some point by the president if no one else can clear it up. And that's really what I'm waiting to hear. There's not a hint of evidence from the president's own comments that he has decided that regime change in Syria is his priority. And I think, honestly, the best way to look at this mess in the whole region is not to talk about Syria as if it's a country that still exists anymore. I think it's broken. I think Iraq is broken, too. I think these two Humpty Dumptys that were created 100 years ago when the Europeans carved up the Ottoman Empire have been fundamentally shattered. And what we need to do is be thinking about a broader regional strategy post-ISIS. And I'm assuming that the new strategy that Trump has asked the Pentagon for will be forthcoming, and we will prevail by the end of this year, if not before, certainly. And then we have to decide, once ISIS is removed from the territory it now holds in Syria and in Iraq, who takes control of that territory? I just don't think the Sunni Arabs, let's say in eastern and southern Syria, will say, well, okay, if ISIS is gone, we're just going to happily go back under the authority of the Assad regime. That isn't going to happen. And I think the Arabs in western Iraq are not going to say, remembering that the Kurds are effectively out of Iraq entirely. Nobody from Baghdad's telling them what to do. The Sunni Arabs are not going to want to go back into an Iraq where they are outnumbered 3-1 by Shia Arabs, many of which are dominated by the Ayatollahs in Tehran. So I'm not sure these countries exist anymore. I'm not sure that nation building to put them back together is worth the effort. I understand in the Pentagon there's a lot of work going on about how to put Iraq together. I hope this is not the old cliche of generals fighting the last war over again, but it was hard enough to do nation building before American troops were withdrawn in 2011. I don't see any prospect of putting it back together at this point. Now, if suddenly the Iraqi parties decide that they really want a nation, they're willing to throw the Iranian influence out, maybe something can change, but I don't see it.
Well, so here's the thing. Over the weekend, from McMaster, from Haley, from Tillerson, we heard a lot of loose talk about a political solution. And I mean, I'm a little bit flummoxed by the logic, particularly advanced by McMaster, that it is not credible to believe the Russians didn't know about the chemical attack last Tuesday in Syria. And yet the Russians have to ask themselves some hard questions about why they're aligning with this murderous regime. And maybe we could take, essentially he implies, maybe we could take a back seat to Russia in terms of bringing Assad to the table and advancing a political solution. That doesn't seem to me like a particularly realistic possibility at this juncture. So if that's not, then what is the framework for a political solution that doesn't involve American troops?
Well, I think somewhere the spirit of John Kerry is smiling, since he spent 4 years as Secretary of State telling us week after week that they're working with the Russians to move Assad out of power and so on and so forth. I'll tell you what the Russians want there. They want their naval facility at Tartus in Syria, and they want to keep their new air base at Latakia in Syria. If you've looked at maps that have appeared in the newspapers after the attack Thursday night of where there are Russian facilities, Russian forces, Russian service members in Syria, they're all over the place, controlled in the areas controlled by the government. And they're not moving out voluntarily. I mean, I think there might be somebody other than Assad that they would find acceptable. But if anybody thinks they're going to agree to a political settlement that puts their positions, their military positions in Syria in jeopardy, they should think again.
Well, but then then what is, I mean, you're talking about a regional strategy. Then if you were advising the president, what are some of the component parts of the regional strategy you would be promoting? Because are we talking again about going from 500 American troops on the ground to some multiple of that to affect not only the eradication of ISIS, that would lead potentially to deposing Assad and then installing I guess a group that are our cultural enemies now in the hopes they become our friends? That seems to be, the kind of finding a needle in a haystack too.
No, but think again about this. Just understand or imagine, as I've said, there is no Syria.
Okay.
I mean, I know if you put a map on the wall, I can see the lines too, but that doesn't mean they mean anything.
Right.
You can only have one priority in the region at a time, and I think President Trump made it clear during the campaign his priority was destroying ISIS, not the Obama approach of degrade and ultimately destroy. Remove all the adjectives, get right to the word destroy, and that's why he's been pressing the Pentagon for new military options. Now, as well as making the decision on how your military strategy vis-a-vis ISIS is going to change, you then have to make the decision, what do you do in the post-ISIS world there? And I think that looking at what is potentially the next conflict, and that is the arc of power, the arc of control that Iran is trying to create through the Baghdad government, which it largely controls, through the Assad regime in Syria, and through Hezbollah in Lebanon. We want to defeat ISIS in a way that minimizes the upside for that coalition, which, by the way, is backed by the Russians. Because to the extent the influence of Iran and its allies rises, the risks to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the other oil-producing monarchies in the region increase. And if we don't want to leave our friends in a worse position for the next conflict, which will also see, in all likelihood, an Iran armed with nuclear weapons, we've got to be thinking of it here in the context of defeating ISIS. It's possible, for example, to imagine Assad being left in control of what some call the Alawite enclave. I just want somebody to explain to me why the Sunni Arabs of eastern and southern Syria would ever be willing to accept Assad back in power. And I'd like somebody to tell me why the Russians would ever throw him out of power. I mean, there are some problems that don't have a solution that makes people happy. And if making people happy means recreating Syria, I think you could wait a long time for that.
Well, let's move on to North Korea because U.S. has rerouted warships toward the Korean peninsula. Is this just a way of flexing our muscles, or is there something there that we don't know about?
No, I think one of the consequences of the attack on the Syrian base from which the chemical weapon strikes were launched was a very powerful signal to Iran, to North Korea, to their patrons in Russia and China, that the president is serious when he says he doesn't want to see weapons of mass destruction, whether they're chemical, biological, or nuclear, used or proliferated. And so after 8 years of living in fantasy land with Barack Obama, I think they woke up in Pyongyang and Tehran and Moscow and Beijing Friday morning and said, good grief. Who'd have thought the Americans still had the willpower to do that? So now, when you have a regime as erratic, and I'll say it, as irrational in our terms as North Korea is, I think you need to be worried that the regime is capable of doing things that we would say are counterproductive. It was certainly counterproductive for Assad to use chemical weapons, but they may do it because in their bizarre logic, they think it serves their interest. And I think this is a strong show of support for South Korea and of American capabilities in the region.
All right, let's spin the globe again. I'm going to stop my finger on Central America. Is everything old? Is everything that was old new again? In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega reassumed control a decade ago, and now Washington Post is reporting that over the past 2 years, the Russian government is adding muscle to its security partnership there, selling tanks and weapons, sending troops, building facilities intended to train Central American forces to fight drug trafficking. Do we need to scramble Ollie North and get the Contras back together?
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. As if the Russians and the Nicaraguans are concerned about drug trafficking, they're probably running the show. And honestly, I feel sorry for Nicaragua that the Ortega boys are back in power, but it just shows Russia's interfering all around the world. This is part of what Putin meant when he said over 10 years ago that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He wants to reestablish Russian hegemony in the space of the former Soviet Union. He wants to reestablish that presence in the Middle East, in Latin America, and he's actively doing it. And why not from his point of view? In the last 8 years, nobody in Washington, in the White House anyway, was paying any attention to it.
Yeah, well, you're right about that. Just another Leninist in Central America, right? He is former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Ambassador Bolton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks again for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.